One of the key roles that psychologists play in the real world is conducting research. Whether assigned to the medical profession, which we saw earlier was about 25% of psychologists, or in education, another 25% of psychologists, most psychologists are charged with the idea of conducting research. Over time, many of our ancestors advanced the science of medicine and psychology through experimentation. Some of these experiments weren't of the greatest efficacy, meaning they didn't produce results that were in keeping with the hypothesis of the endeavor. So in this case, an ancestor would feel as if there were mental illness occurring and then do an experiment to release that mental illness by drilling a hole in the person's skull in order to attempt a cure. Now, today's day and age, we would be appalled by such an idea, and as we should. Just the notionality that an experiment of that sort can even occur, even if we felt as if the efficacy was there, is appalling in and of itself, and prohibited, as we will talk about. But many good ideas that are researched do not result in scientific outcomes. Many ideas are what we call notional propaganda, meaning good intentions, possibly politically motivated, but ultimately, who can argue that we need to reduce drugs and violence in society? But going about it the way that the DARE program did not produce high efficacy results. It was deemed ineffective. Now, did it do harm? Hopefully not, because in the modern era we have protections against that type of research and those types of endeavors. Ultimately, was it worth the effort? It's hard to say. Research starts with a question and a problem to be solved. So in this case, we have an adult diabetic epidemic in society, a problem to be solved. Now, to solve a gigantic problem of that sort would be tremendous amount of work for multiple research projects and researchers. So we have to limit and be specific about what piece of the diabetic epidemic we want to study. So in this case, we create a research question. Do children like sweets more than adults like sweets? So are we doing a disservice by encouraging children to experience candy and sweets? Is our research question, knowing that sugar and metabolizing sugar is what leads to diabetes in adults. The daily experiences of individuals, the physiology of the idea of sweets, maybe there's a greater metabolism capability as a child than there will be as an adult, and how that daily behavior or online influence affects the question of, do children like sweets more than adults? And what is the problem that we encourage by giving children sweets? So here in this research question, we can be more specific about what it is that we are going to studying. So in this case, does cereal adjust weight? Meaning cereal with sugar, does eating cereal really cause someone to be a healthy weight? So now we have a specific study and a specific research question that's related to sugar in our diet and the concern about healthy weight as a child and how does that affect adults at the end of childhood development. So researchers study lots of different daily experiences, and those experiences can be anything, but it needs to be a daily experience, much like what is our experience of eating cereal with sugar and its effect on weight and diabetes. We now have a Boolean, logical, aligned, theoretical framework to study. Will it solve the whole diabetes crisis? Of course not. Does it give us specific information that could be used towards that aim? Of course. And that is the specificity that we need to be at when we do psychological research. So we want to also be specific about the location because a population might have a target group, but that target group might be students in public school in Dallas, Texas, for instance, a specific location, which may generalize to all populations or may not. A specific social environment. Who are we with when we study the effect of cereal in the schools? Well, we are with public school students in Dallas, Texas. And what activity are we currently doing? Now we refine this further to we're studying people that eat cereal at home. Or we're studying the effect of the school supplying cereal to breakfast students in the morning as part of the school's cafeteria program. And then what is the experience? How do people feel about the experience? Well, in the case of cereal, does it make people happy? And is that why they're doing it? Does it encourage eating breakfast? Is that why we're doing it? And the duality of the long-term implications. So research cycle starts with a hypothesis. The hypothesis might be in this case that it is hypothesized that cereal is provided to elementary school students to encourage eating breakfast. And then we would do empirical observations to determine if that hypothesis is true. The null hypothesis might be that absent of the school supplying cereal, the student would not eat breakfast. The difference between inductive data and deductive data is inductive data is bottom up. So in order to determine inductively from a reasoning perspective the answers to our questions, we would need to interview these students. Deductively, we can look to archival data, past history, prior research about breakfast in the schools and its value, purpose, and outcomes from prior studies. Deductive would be top-down, what we already know. Inductive is research data that we've collected specific to this study from its participants. So in creating our hypothesis, We need to look at the behavior that we are attempting to create and understand, in doing so, what is our intended effect. Every hypothesis has a null hypothesis, is what would the outcome be if we would not have done this study? So, seeing behavior like a youth holding a toy gun, smiling, does this have an effect on the child's programming and development in increasing violence? The null hypothesis might be that no increase in violence comes from toys. The hypothesis might be if a child watches violent TV programming, they might view that programming in a way that endorses the use of gun violence. And hence, this would be our study. So the scientific method is a combination of a theory, a hypothesis, research done through observation, which advances scientific knowledge and adds to the theory. So, if Jean-Paul Sartre's theory of existentialism says that autonomy and agency of the individual gets better results than authoritarian top-down influence of society, then that theory might lead us to a hypothesis that it is better for the individual to make a choice on their health care than it is for the government to dictate the style of health care. And then we would do research. The hypothesis is when an individual has choice over their health care versus the government or an insurance company making the decision, that the outcome is better or more advanced or higher efficacy. We would do observation, and in that observation, we would allow individuals to make choices, and in making those choices, do they make better choices than what the null hypothesis is, the current state of what is dictated by the authoritarianism from an insurance company or government regulations. We may, in the end, come up with scientific data that would add to or subtract from Jean-Paul Sartre's theory of existentialism, which says that the autonomy and agency of the individual advances society in exponential ways over authoritarianism. We have different research modalities. We can do qualitative research versus quantitative research. Quantitative research method compares analytical variables, a dependent versus independent variable. The dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable being modified. When the independent variable changes, what is the effect on the dependent variable? As analytically analyzed using statistics. Qualitative research compares themes, primarily in social research, and has many different designs, narrative designs, grounded theory designs, many different designs in collecting data and analyzing those themes. So the independent variable influences change on the dependent variable. So by manipulations of the independent variable, we see what the effect is on the dependent variable. This is the core notion of quantitative statistical research, largely in when there are two variables that can be analyzed using mathematical quantification. Surveys and interviews can collect this data. We also can collect data by the results of experiments, testing, labs, etc. We can also collect data from existing data sets. Prior research always includes its data set, and that data is accessible to future researchers to use, assuming that the theoretical constructs, the hypothesis, maintains validity as time goes on. So the notion from the theory of evolution that all human condition is genetic and passes down intergenerationally is no longer seen as the empirical evidence in the modern era. We now know that it is biological, influenced by the psychology, influenced by the sociology, and changes in core constructs like culture, values, ethnicity can be modified in the modern era, and those modifications right back to the neurological and genetic systems that can be passed down in a single generation or over multiple generations, but do not require the kinds of long-term transmission that was anticipated. A longitudinal study, though, does study the effects of genetics over time. It studies how does smoking affect people in multiple generations. So to conduct a longitudinal study, it would take a long time. And if a longitudinal study uses archival data from different generations in order to piece together the effect of smoking on the individual, then that longitudinal study would state from 1920 to the current era over 10-year, 5-year increments, this is the effect that smoking had on an individual's respiratory system, oxygen, metabolism capacity, for instance. So there are limitations to experimental research. We cannot do things that are unethical. We now have to have ethic boards review the practicality and the logistics of our experiment to determine if it's actually doable and if it can be done without doing harm or deceiving the people in the experiment. All research must be evaluated through peer reviews to ensure that the problem statement is specific, that it is measurable, that we can actually complete the study within the specified timeline. It's actually achievable that we could get a approval to study a certain population, and in studying that population, come to the conclusion that we seek from answering the research question. Is it realistic and is it timely? All problem statements must follow these rules in order to ensure that the research is actually doable and not too large in scope to be achievable. From a statistics perspective, we end up with scatter plots. These scatter plots are generally conducted by software, but you can use math and do these using statistical analysis manual methods in order to learn what's happening with the statistics. We are looking at a positive correlation between weight and height, weight and tiredness, shoe size and weight. Well, that would be no correlation, but in this case, there is some correlation between weight and height. Between the hours of sleep and tiredness, there is a negative correlation, meaning the less hours of sleep, the more tired we feel. So, negative correlation. The hours of sleep and shoe size are totally non-related. Scattered diagram. Medical research typically has a placebo effect, meaning it's generally required by policing authorities that we actually test bias within the study to ensure that a person is not anticipating the outcome. And the way we do that is that a percentage of the participants in the study are given a placebo, something that has no effect. And that is studied against the people that are administered, for instance, a new experimental pharmaceutical. If the inert ingredient that is intended to have no effect, you hear the word sugar pill, has the same or independent outcome that the actual medication does, then we understand that there's some type of bias within the study in which the participants anticipated an outcome and experienced that outcome regardless of the effect of the medication itself. So we always have a population. If we are studying the effect of a new diabetes medication on people with diabetes, that might be a valuable population to study, but we cannot find every person that has diabetes. So we have to create a target population, and that target population might be the people who have diabetes in Dallas, Texas. And then a sample will be created from the people who have diabetes in Dallas, Texas, and are treated at the University of Texas for that diabetic condition. A sample which is reasonable for us to obtain, hopefully, from those people by getting permission to use the sample of the population which exist and are accessible at UT Southwestern's hospital in Dallas. We talked about ethics, and every institution has a review board called an IRB, Institutional Review Board. They meet in order to ensure that all experiments proposed are being done in ethical ways in which the two constructs of ethics, no deception and no harm, occur. This is generated by prior studies in which harm was introduced. For instance, you've heard of the Tuskegee Airmen who were studied after World War II by injecting syphilis and testing what the effect of that was on them. There was deception involved because they were not told that they were participants in this study. And the study itself caused harm because, as we know, syphilis can be deadly and has definite health effects that were not disclosed. And even if they were disclosed, it's suspect on whether the study would be allowed under effective ethics in the modern era.